Welcome to Deeply Rooted Online, where women encourage women by sharing scripture and stories of God at work.
Hello, ladies. It's so good to be back with you again. And of course, with my good friends, Martha Muntz, Val Forbes, and Esther Jennings. I just wanted to be able to greet you and say there's a Women's Night coming up, April 29th. Mark your calendars in person. Hope to see you there. No further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Val.
Well, thank you, Carrie. Have you ever watched a TV series and, you know, they leave you, that one episode leaves you at the most suspenseful part and you're thinking, I can't wait for next week. Oh my goodness, to find out what's going to happen. Now imagine living that suspense and that waiting. And that's what Jairus had to do. And that's our story today in Mark 5 about Jairus and how he had to wait at one of the worst times in his life. And we pick it up in Mark 5, and it's in verse 21. And it talks about these crowds of people following Jesus, and out of the crowd comes a man who's a religious leader, that says, a religious ruler. And he throws himself at the feet of Jesus and implores him. Talk about somebody who is at his wit's end. This is a religious leader, and he is going to prostrate himself, humble himself to the point of throwing himself on the ground because of a dire situation. He says to the Lord, my little daughter is at the point of death. And another gospel tells us it's his only daughter. And he says, come, lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. And as they carry on with these crowds, so can you imagine trying to go somewhere quickly and you're surrounded by people? And then there's this odd little thing that happens. Another story crops up, and we actually address that story in another depot. Another story crops up, and Jesus stops to attend to somebody else. And all I could think of is poor Jairus wondering, what? I have to wait? You're making me wait while my daughter is about to die? It would be so hard. And sometimes, ladies, waiting is uncomfortable. We don't like it. It was uncomfortable for Jairus because, as I said, he's a religious leader and he's throwing himself at the feet of Jesus, and he's at Jesus's mercy. He knows he's at the mercy of God in dealing with his daughter. He did this in front of a lot of crowds. They witnessed his distress. That's hard. That's got to be very humbling to do that. It's just not always comfortable to be waiting. But Jesus, when he did stop, he stops for somebody maybe you would consider insignificant. You would think that the needs of Jairus with his daughter dying would be a little more important than this lady who has a health issue. But God doesn't make a distinction. And I just think that's wonderful. In our waiting, you know, when we have that trial, that big, huge, oh, this is so big, and Lord, I've been putting this before you, and I'm just waiting for your answer. Do we get so bogged down in our waiting with blinkers on that we don't see others? And Jesus is teaching them at this time. There's other things going on in this world. And we are to be caring and loving in all circumstances. It doesn't say in the Bible, oh, only when you aren't under trial yourself. So it's a little bit of a lesson for Jairus and for the people as well, to see this lady, this destitute lady, being treated before, really, Jairus' daughter. And, you know, Jesus could just have spoken. He's done that in another portion of scripture where he just spoke and that person was healed. Not in this case. In this case, the waiting is the lesson. And waiting doesn't mean that it's all about me. Jairus had to calmly, I don't know if he was calm inside, but we certainly don't hear him going, Lord, can we hurry? Lord. Not once, not a word is out of Jairus. He waits while Jesus attends to this other lady. And sometimes in our distress, we need to wait as well. And we need to remember God's at work. We don't see it, but he is at work. And then something happens and the waiting can seem like there's no hope. The servant comes up. This is after he's healed this other lady. And the servant comes up and he says, oh, bad news. Your daughter is dead. She has died. Please, just don't bother the master anymore. That's it. She's dead. You know, I look at that and I sometimes think that there are people, and if we listen to them, the world maybe, or somebody who's just not living strong for the Lord, they can say, you know what, the situation looks hopeless. Look at the answer. You've already lost your job. You've already, whatever it is, just give up. Just stop going to Jesus because it's done. We can allow that voice to come in. Jairus doesn't do that. Jairus also doesn't go ahead of God. Can you imagine if he thought, oh, he's stopping to heal somebody. I better get going and see how my daughter's doing. And what if he ran ahead? And what if he had met that servant before he got to Jesus, heard this horrible news, and was so despondent he just didn't bother coming back because it's too late? What if that happened? And I think sometimes we can find ourselves in that position, and we've got to be careful. And Jesus is showing us a great example, a great lesson. The wait is where the growth comes and the power comes in the wait, even though it's so hard, it's so uncomfortable, and it's not about me. And sometimes, like I said, it seems like there's no hope. Jairus carries on with the Lord, and the Lord stops the crowd, and he only allows a certain few to come with him. And they go into the house where the little girl, she's dead. There's mourners there. They're crying. And he says, no, the little girl's only sleeping. Then it tells us there's jeering. They make fun of him. They mock him. Who do you think you are? She's dead. And he doesn't care about them. Jesus brings them into the room, touches this little girl, brings her back to life. And then he says, feed her. After she walks around, she shows she's alive. He says, feed her. A little tiny detail. And yet that's what our God is. He is a God of the detail as well. So that little detail, sometimes we overlook it. It was just a basic need. The big thing was that he raised her from the dead. But God's in the details, and in our waiting, sometimes we need to remember there's little details going on to show us God's at work. So this waiting that we don't like, none of us like to wait. We usually always want the answer like that. But no, God is in it. God is directing it. And I just think this is such a great example to us of how we should be in our waiting. And I'm wondering, ladies, if you've come across times where you've been waiting, and what did you do? Where did God show up? Where did you go to for support and encouragement? Or did you fall off the rails?
It is hard to wait, and it is hard to know what God is doing in that time when he seems so silent. But it's in those times when he's working, like you said. And what I loved about this passage, if you look at verse 37, remember we have all these crowds following him, but Jesus wanted to do his best work with his chosen three and in private. He doesn't need a lot of fanfare, and he doesn't need to perform his miracles for applause. It says, and he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. And then it goes on about the commotion that was out there. He entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. But he took only his chosen three in, and he took her hand. And I love the compassion. He says, little girl, I say to you, arise. He could have said it from the doorway. He could have said it from the walkway into the house, but he took her hand and he said, little girl. And so I love that compassion. And I love the fact that he works in private. He works in the places where nobody else can see except his chosen few. And so I'm just touched by his compassionate heart.
Yes. And he showed it to everybody. That's the other part, Esther, that struck me in this story, is that we have the religious leaders. We have the throngs of people who just wanted to see what was going on. We have his followers, his avid followers who are there as well. Then we have the grieving. Then we have the destitute, the woman who had the issue, the health issue. She's just destitute. She's unclean. She is there. We have the servant. He could have right there and then said, rebuked the servant for coming with that kind of news. We have the crowds that jeered him when he said that she's just sleeping. We had the grieving people that are there weeping and wailing. We have the parents who must have been absolutely stricken. And then we have the child, which also is just such a simple picture as well. And Jesus is the same throughout every one of them. Every one of them saw Jesus and he didn't change. Their reaction to him were all different. He did not change. He showed compassion all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
This makes me think about how God is a God of resurrection. Jesus is a God of resurrection. And I did have an experience that stands out. I was teaching JK, but I didn't have my teacher certificate. And I really felt that God wanted me to go into teaching. So I applied for a teaching job and I didn't get it. And I was sure as sure could be, that's where I should be. And God and I spent a few tense moments talking, and I did some storming. But, I decided to wait on the Lord. Like in the end, after bringing God my frustration and my anger, I waited on the Lord. And it wasn't just 1 year or 2 years, it was a few years. But then in my career, I've taught for 17 years and 2 of them as a principal. So God raised that hope that I had. And I think many times we have things in our lives that die, whether it's a dream we've had or a hope or something that we're longing for, or an ability that we've lost something. And God is the one who raises that up and brings it to fruition in his time. And I was looking at Psalm 27 in verse 13, the psalmist says, I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. So I would just encourage anyone who's had a huge disappointment, wait for the Lord. He is the God of resurrection. And if this is a good thing for you, he will resurrect that and bring it back to life in the right time.
Well, and that's right, too. It's God's time, not our time. I've spent many years in prayer over different things. And sometimes it's been a couple of months where there's an answer to prayer, or 2 decades. So keep the hope. And I'd just like to ask Val what she'd like us to take home from this message.
Where my heart was landing was back to Jairus. Back to Jairus, who started this all and implored the Lord to please heal his daughter. And then that whole waiting, the trip back to the house, the interruptions and all the crowd. And I'm sure he was thinking, what? I have to wait? This is very important. And I just think, like we've all been saying, what we can learn in that wait. God has a plan in that wait. He doesn't waste our fears. He doesn't waste our tears. He has a plan. And when we go ahead of it, that's when we get into trouble. And so I'm going to go to the Psalms as well, Martha. And I like this Psalm, Psalm 62. It says in verse 5, for God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. And that's what we need to remember. In our wait, he is there and he has a plan. He will be with you. Wait on the Lord.
Well, thank you so much, Val. We're happy that you can join us, and we thank you for your time. Remember, always stay deeply rooted.
Thanks for joining us at Deeply Rooted today. If God has been speaking to you and you want to connect with someone for prayer, email us at deeplyrooted@myharvestchurch.ca. Be sure to subscribe to this channel to receive notifications when new content is released. And finally, let's stay connected with one another and deeply rooted in Christ.